Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about the books that I read in March of 2025. You'll probably know that in March I was hosting a readathon, the Herstoryathon, where we celebrate Women's History Month by reading at least one book, either fiction or non-fiction, that is about a real life woman who lived in the past. My intention was really that was where I was going to focus my reading, though I'm not going to lie to you, I feel like in terms of being a Herstoryathon host, not that I failed, but I definitely haven't done as well this year as I have done in years past with this reading challenge. Having only read 3 or 4 books, that would count towards that. I suppose by the parameters that I have set for other people getting involved, then yes, I have succeeded, but I always want to read a lot more Herstoryathon during March than I did this year. But without me feeling too sorry for myself and taking up too much of your time, let's just get straight into the books that I read in March. And I'm actually starting with a book that I finished in February, but I forgot to include in my last wrap-up, and that was Romancing the Duke by Tessa. You'll know that I am a big fan of Tessa historical romances. In this, we are following the main character of Izzy Goodnight, who is a young lady, the daughter of a famous author who recently died. He left her with very little in terms of money, but she does discover that she has inherited a pretty decrepit looking castle. And so we meet her at the beginning of the book having arrived at this castle, surprised to find that this is her inheritance. There's only one problem though, and that is that this castle is occupied by the handsome and brooding Duke of Rothbury, whose first name is Ransom. Only in romance books, eh? Who, upon further acquaintance, she finds out is actually blind as a result of injury sustained in battle. As I say, he's very brooding, he's very embittered, he is not generally a very nice person to be around, and he is adamant that he is staying put in the castle and that she cannot have it. Upon learning that the Duke can't do any of his correspondence, Izzy agrees to act as his secretary to sort out the piles and piles of letters that have come to him while he's been staying there. And as you can imagine, romance blooms from there. I'd say this is a romance that is pretty typical of Tessa. You've got especially great side characters, some really good banter going on here. However, I would say that your tolerance level on the very grumpy lead may vary. Tessa is known for writing pretty snarky, witty, grumpy leading men, but Ransom can sometimes verge on being pretty intolerable and just downright horrible in what he says to people. And I can understand completely his predicament, that he is very bitter and jaded, that he doesn't trust people, and that's leading him to push away, the people who are good for him. But at times in this book, he's also just a bit of a dick. And I genuinely got to a point in this book where I was like, I don't understand why anybody is dealing with him, because he's just not a very nice person. There are also some other things that grated on me. So Izzy's father was known for writing this kind of fantastical series, and it has a very fervent fan base which follow Izzy around, particularly because the main character is named after her. And they basically are stalking her, dressed up as characters from the series. These characters just kind of bordered on the ridiculous, and every time they'd pop up I just didn't understand why they were there. We've also got a very typical protagonist who thinks that she is so ugly that no man will ever want her. Tessa has kind of explored that in the past with her characters, but with Izzy it became almost parody. So yeah, as much as I enjoyed this one because it is Tessa and there's a lot of things in there that I normally enjoy, there were just aspects of this book that made me feel like it wasn't quite as strong as other installments in her work. A book which I finished off in March was A Poem for Every Winter Day by Allie Esiri. This is a collection of poems where she is presenting 2 poems per day, one that you can read in the day, one that you can read at night, which are all around different topics to do with winter, whether that is Christmas, Burns Night, just generally about the cold. I'm slowly but surely trying to work my way through the Allie Esiri books. I've generally not been very disciplined at reading them every day, and that is still holding true, but I am determined that I will finish these this year. Then the very first book that I finished that counted for Herstoryathon was Life on the Golden Horn by Wortley Montagu. This is a collection of letters which she sent to her various acquaintances while she was travelling in Constantinople in the 18th century. We start off with her journey there, particularly going around Italy, but the majority of these letters focus in on Turkish society and particularly the experiences of Turkish women. You see her making reference to Turkish architecture, to clothing. There's also a very strong pull in here on how other travel writers haven't been able to talk about women's experiences because most of these travel writers have been men and have not had access to these spaces. Wortley Montagu goes into comparing the different freedoms between Turkish women and English women, and there are some aspects of Turkish living where she decides that actually things are a little bit better in Constantinople for women than they necessarily are for English women. It's a really interesting read. I've never read 18th century letters that are dealing so heavily with travel from a woman's perspective. There were some moments here where I was a little bit concerned of her maybe exoticizing, downplaying things that we would find distasteful now, such as slavery. But yeah, definitely an interesting read. The next book that I read was Everything is Okay by Tung, which is a little graphic novel which is looking at themes of mental health, anxiety and depression, ranging from small everyday troubles to greater, more existential concerns that people have, and speaking thinking about how to pull through it. I've read a couple of Debbie Tung's graphic novels before and found them incredibly relatable and incredibly beautifully told. I actually didn't read the physical copy of this as I have for her previous work. I just found it as an ebook at my local library, and I just really enjoyed flicking through this, looking at the beautiful illustrations and just kind of feeling this solidarity and this comfort from this graphic novel that other people have also felt the way that I have, and that maybe you can't fix everything now, but there are little things that you can do to get yourself on your way. The next book that I read for Herstoryathon is one that has been very eagerly anticipated for me, and that was Mary I, Queen of Sorrows by Alison Weir. This is her third and I believe final book in her Tudor Roses trilogy, looking at the life of Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, her experiences growing up in the Tudor court, seeing her mother be supplanted by Anne Boleyn, and the ramifications of the annulment of her father and mother's marriage and his subsequent marriages, how that affected Mary both legally, logistically, but also emotionally. It had a tremendous emotional and health impact on her. We're looking at her very loyal allegiance to her mother, and particularly her fervent Catholic faith, how stressful it must have been shuttling backwards and forwards in her father's affection, the change of pace with her brother, who was much more Protestant, and then once her brother dies, her having to fight for her throne against different powers that want to put Lady Jane Grey in her place. And then once she is finally on the throne, her troubles are far from over. Yes, she is on the throne, yes, she is finally married, but knowing that her position is tenuous and her legacy is even more tenuous if she doesn't have an heir. The ramping up of persecution against Protestants, leading to the many executions of her reign that would lead her to get the sobriquet of Bloody Mary. Alison Weir is really dealing with whether or not any of this is fair, and I think the conclusion that she comes to is that as sympathetic as Mary is in her early life, that in no way excuses what she ended up doing during her reign. It's really interesting reading her author note at the end, where she really discusses this, how much she was able to empathise with Mary, herself being a child of divorce, and the emotional turmoil that she's going through, but she could never find herself fully engaging with Mary and fully getting on her side because of the events of her reign. And I can imagine it must have been a really hard balancing act. As I generally find with Alison Weir, this is packed full of historical detail. I can't think off the top of my head any major changes that she does make to what we know in the historical record, which is good for me. There's nothing that really squeaked me out about this, which I cannot say about all of Alison Weir's books. I'd probably say this was the highlight of my Herstoryathon reading. I'm definitely looking forward to her next book, which is looking at Cardinal Wolsey. And then the final book I have to talk about for this wrap up is The Lost Queen by Carol McGrath. This is once again historical fiction looking at the life of another Queen of England, this time a Queen Consort, and it is Berengaria of Navarre, who was wife to Richard I, or otherwise known as Richard the Lionheart. My understanding of this book was that this was going to take place during the journey that Berengaria would undertake with her mother-in-law Eleanor of Aquitaine to reach Richard on crusade. I thought that that was going to be the entirety of this story, but actually it makes up very little of this narrative. This takes place over the full period of her time as Queen Consort, so multiple years. This story is also intertwined with a fictional character who was created for the purposes of this book, who is called Lady Evelina, who is on her own personal mission to find her missing husband, which was a great story in itself. I just don't necessarily know that we needed it for this book. But this was a really interesting book because you're getting a look at queenship from a very different perspective, being a queen on crusade, and a queen who, as far as we know, never stepped foot on English soil. Berengaria's time as queen took place entirely on crusade, and she never actually got to know the English subjects that she was queen to. For me, it was a really unique and interesting narrative. And I think for that reason, Berengaria of Navarre has often been quite an overlooked queen. There are very few sources about her life. I don't believe that there is like a full biography of her because there's just very little to go on. And this was really great at building up more of a character for her, making her a really distinct figure in her own right, even if she is competing against rather big personalities like Eleanor of Aquitaine, like Richard the Lionheart, even her sister-in-law Joanna Plantagenet, who I was really glad to get more of a sense of ahead of reading the Catherine Hanley biography of her. I can't necessarily say for sure that Berengaria of Navarre was as intelligent and resourceful and spirited as Carol McGrath paints her, but I would like to think so. So there we go, that is the first half of the books that I read during March 2025. Please do let me know if you've read any of the books I've spoken to you about today. Alternatively, please let me know about any books that you read in March and particularly loved. Did you read anything for Herstoryathon? Especially, I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.